Good afternoon, everyone. This is the March 30th, 2021 meeting of the City Finance Committee. And may I have a roll call, please?
Yes, good afternoon, Committee Chair. We'll start with Committee Member Alejandro Gutierrez.
Here.
Committee Member Megan Harmon.
Here.
And Committee Chair Eric Friedman.
Present. Thank you, Mr. DiMartini. So we are all here, so we'll move on to the agenda. Before we get to the first item, I will open it up to any general public comment for items not on today's agenda. If you could raise your hand in the app, and I will look and see if anyone is on there. And I don't see anybody who is raising their hand, so I will close general public comment. And I'll move on to today's discussion, which is our water, wastewater, and solid waste rates. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Hamilton.
Yes, thank you, Chair Friedman, members of the committee, Malcolm Hamilton, Water Resources Financial Officer. We have a two-part presentation today. The first part will be on proposed water rates for fiscal years 22, 23, and 24. And then I'll turn it over to the Sustainability and Resiliency Department to talk about proposed solid waste rates for fiscal year 2022. Just a note on that, 2 years ago, we at this time adopted wastewater rates, so we aren't currently going to be discussing wastewater rates in this presentation. Now, in terms of water rates, we started this effort back in July or August of 2019, and we had originally intended to bring rate increases forward last year. Of course, with the pandemic, we ultimately recommended to City Council that we forego a water rate increase. And so essentially we've held our rates flat for the last year. And the intent there, of course, was to provide some relief to the community as much as we could from the water bill perspective. We are putting forward a plan, we'll discuss this more in the presentation today, to increase our investment in water infrastructure. And additionally, another major theme for us in terms of costs is an anticipation of increasing operating costs as well. So those two factors combined with some more nuanced details are leading us to put forward proposed rate increases over the next 3 years for water rates. Now, the rates, as we'll describe more in the presentation, do continue to support conservation and the efficient use of potable water within the city. And with that, I will turn it over to Sean Korn from HDR Engineering, our rate consultant, to give the remainder of the water portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Good afternoon, Chair Friedman and members of the committee. As Mr. Hamilton said, my name is Sean Korn with HDR Engineering, and I'll be walking you through the summary of the water rate study and discussion of the proposed rates. On the next slide, we have a summary of the presentation. I'll touch real briefly on the purpose of the study and then walk through the assumptions and results of each of the 3 steps of a water rate study: a revenue requirement, a cost of service, and rate design, and then talk about the next steps and then transition into the solid waste presentation. On the next slide is a summary of the purpose of the rate study, and really, as we kick off any rate study, we focus on a couple of key issues. The first being developing proportional, equitable, and cost-based rates that meet the requirements and intent of Proposition 218, which governs the overall rate setting process for water rates in California, that provides sufficient revenue to operate and maintain the city's water infrastructure. So as we put this process together in the study, we follow the requirements of 218 to meet those overall funding needs for the city's water utility based on generally accepted methodologies, but tailored around the city's specific system characteristics and customer characteristics. So how the customers use the water and then how the city provides that water service to those customers. As we go through that, we also need to maintain some of our prudent financial planning criteria, such as legally required debt service coverage ratios, which is something that comes along with existing debt that you have for the water utility, as well as ensuring that we're funding adequate levels of capital investment. So the pay-as-you-go component of the capital plan to maintain and continue to provide water service. And then finally, meeting our council minimum target reserve policies. So making sure we're hitting some of our big three key financial parameters as we go through this process. To do that, on the next slide, we have a summary of the rate study process. And it is a three-step sequential process, very similar to the wastewater process we went through a couple of years ago. But it really starts with the revenue requirement, determining those operating and capital needs to provide water service to your customers. And what is the overall revenue impact to the water utility to provide that service? Once we know the overall level of revenues that are needed in the revenue requirement, we then equitably and proportionally allocate that to the different customer classes or the rate schedules of the city's customers. And this is really based on how the customers use the water system, what their characteristics are and how they use the water from a service perspective, and then the source of supply, which is a key driver in the development of the city's water cost of service study. What comes out of that cost of service study is unit costs, and those unit costs ultimately become the proposed rates in the rate design component, the third step, for that first year. And then we build off those unit costs for subsequent years to meet the overall revenue requirement needs. So on the next slide, we'll have a start of the revenue requirement discussion. And this again outlines the overall operating and capital needs and the level of revenue adjustment necessary to meet that. So as a system, what is the total revenue needs? So the next slide provides our key assumptions to the analysis. And we started with our fiscal year 2021 adopted water budget. We projected that out through fiscal year 2029 based on inflationary factors. We targeted about 3.5% a year inflationary factor. That's really based on looking back at the cost that the city water utility has incurred, the changes over time, and really reflects the overall change we're seeing in the water utility industry on average to meet the overall costs on an annual basis. So that inflationary component doesn't necessarily follow our typical consumer price index or other indices that are out there as we have continued increases in costs for chemicals and other supplies, electricity, as well as the overall cost of infrastructure, the concrete, and pipe material that is necessary. Built into this revenue requirement over the time period we're reviewing, we have added $150,000 annually for an additional customer assistance program. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that's built into this model to be funded through other miscellaneous revenues. Under Prop 218, we cannot subsidize one customer over another with rate revenues. So we're using other miscellaneous revenues to fund that program. As Mr. Hamilton mentioned, one of the key elements of this study was evaluating the overall capital improvement plan for fiscal year 2021 through fiscal year 2029. And really our focus is on this next 3-year period, fiscal year 22, fiscal year 23, and fiscal year 24. But we also want to make sure we look out long term to make sure that we're looking around the corner to see what's coming and make sure we can plan for those today. As we went through this study then, one of the key elements is a transition to a higher level of ongoing capital investment and really a higher investment in pay-as-you-go capital, so that annual rate-funded capital to maintain the system. And that is really there to reflect an aging water system infrastructure and to continue to provide the high level of water service to your customers. As we balance that plan out over the time period, we are looking at some specific new debt obligations or additional borrowing to balance the overall plan of funding capital needs out over this time period. Another key assumption is looking at how customers use water. And given we're still in the COVID pandemic, we haven't got back to our normal approaches of working. We wanted to look at what the overall change in customer metered water demands would be. And so we've looked through the current recent customer demands. We projected that out based on some of the city's other documents and planning information And right now, the model holds our short-term demands flat with an uptick beginning in fiscal year 2024. So we kept it flat and then ramping it up back to historical growth projections. And as we've gone through this process, we've maintained our legally required debt service coverage ratios and meeting our council minimum reserve ending policies. So as I mentioned on the next slide, we have a key element is funding our capital investment and how we're funding that on an ongoing basis. And as we've gone through this process and transitioning to that higher level of pay-as-you-go funding is necessary and reflected in the proposed rates to continue to provide safe and reliable drinking water to the city's customers. It also targets a level of funding on an annual basis that is greater than the current annual depreciation expense level. And that's an important aspect to consider because if we're only funding annual depreciation, that is a lower cost than what the actual replacement of those infrastructure items are over the long term. So we want to make sure that we're adequately funding that on an annual basis, and that's a key element. This also allows us, given our aging infrastructure, to reduce emergency repairs in the future. So again, unforeseen capital projects, additional O&M costs related to emergency repairs or main breaks as you go forward. The overall plan also does specifically look at key components of the capital replacement needs. That includes replacing 6 miles of water mains annually. And that additional increase in annual funding reflects a change from 3 miles per year in the last rate study. So moving up to 6 miles of water main replacements. There's also several key projects included in this time period. It's replacing and rehabilitating our current storage reservoirs at the Cater Water Treatment Plant for the finished water reservoir, as well as the Vic Trace Reservoir. And both of these reservoirs provide a key element of the overall water service to your customers. There's also annual upgrades to the transmission system, or how you just get the water from each source of supply to the customers throughout the system, those larger pipes that are out there, as well as your ongoing maintenance and capital repair for treatment facilities, groundwater facilities, pump stations, and other meter infrastructure. On the next slide, we have a summary of the overall capital transition. And what you see here on the slide is the history and the projection of pay-as-you-go capital funding. So starting on the left side of the graph, we have the 2016 and 2017 budgeted capital pay-as-you-go component. For 2018, 19, and 20, that is the level of pay-as-you-go capital identified in the prior rate study. So the rates that are in place today were based on that rate study. As we transition out over the next several years, you can see through 2021 through 2026, then that steps up and reflects that increased level of from 3 miles to 6 miles, as well as that increased level of pay-as-you-go capital to meet those overall capital funding needs for the long term. So taking that to kind of give you a little understanding, on the next slide, we have a simple comparison of what the average is for each of these periods. So prior to this rate study on the left-hand side, so the prior rate study and budgeted amounts, you can see that runs at about $8 million a year on average. Transitioning to the proposed rates and this current rate study, given the overall level of capital needs that are out there, as well as an approach to prudently funding those through a balance of pay-as-you-go funding, targeted long-term debt issuances, and other funding sources, we transition that up to approximately $14 million a year. So again, about a $6 million a year increase in our average pay-as-you-go level of funding to reflect that increased need to replace more of the system, to move towards meeting target levels from the council for 6 miles of mains a year, as well as replacing that aging infrastructure on a continual basis. All of this comes together on the next slide, which is a summary of our revenue requirement. And our revenue requirement is made up of 3 primary components. It's our O&M expenses, that's the blue or the bottom part of each of these bars. our rate-funded capital, our pay-as-you-go, that's the red portion of the bars, and then our annual debt service, which is the green portion of the bars. So we sum all of those up to give us our total revenue requirement in each of the years. So we go from fiscal year 21, which is our budget, through our projected 2026. Again, our focus is really on fiscal year 2022, 2023, and 2024 for the rate setting purposes. What you can see is the horizontal line across the screen, that's solid. That is our current level of revenues today. So as you can see, that they are not meeting the overall operating capital or debt service payments over time. In order to meet that, we developed the rate transition plan. You can see on the bottom of the slide here, 5% annually through 2025 and a 4.5% overall revenue increase in 2026. That takes the horizontal solid line to that inclined dashed line to reflect the overall system funding needs. And so for the revenue requirement overall, and again, this is not specific to each customer class, this is the system needs to increase roughly 5% a year for the next 3 years to meet our operating needs for our proposed rate adjustments. The next slide starts off our cost of service. Now that we know the overall revenue needs we need to collect, we can transition into our cost of service to proportionally and equitably distribute those costs to each of our different customer classes. So slide 12 provides, the next slide provides us with the overall purpose of a cost of service. And really we do this to meet the need and requirement of Proposition 218. It provides us the method or the approach to equitably and proportionally allocate our costs, our revenue requirement, to each of the different customer classes. And we do this so that we can develop average unit costs, which become our rates in year one. And that provides us the basis to avoid subsidies so that one customer class is not paying more or less than they should, and that the revenues generated from each customer class or rate schedule reflects the overall cost on the system. So what this looks like on the next slide, some of our key assumptions is we start with fiscal year 2022. That's the year we allocate costs for. That's our first year of our proposed rate transition plan over the next 3 years. And it reflects the overall facility or service requirements of each customer class. And it's really a snapshot and a point of time based on our costs for fiscal year 2022 and our current customer characteristics. And this first year of a rate study is really the reset year. So each time you do a study, we look at the cost of service, we reset that, and then we adjust rates evenly for the next years of the proposed rate adjustment under Proposition 218. And the next study resets our cost of service year, and we start over with that process. And that way, we capture how customers use the system differently, as well as the different costs that the city incurs to provide service. So under Proposition 218, then we develop the maximum rates for each customer class. And for the city's analysis, that's really based on the average cost of water by source, as well as how customer classes of service or rate schedules use the facilities and the level to which they use those. As I mentioned, that develops our unit costs. And then as you go through this process continually, we refine this analysis so that your cost of service results continue to change over time to reflect the system needs. The next slide is a summary of our cost of service analysis. This is for each of our customer classes or our rate schedules. And so we have at the bottom, single family residential, multifamily residential, recycled, commercial, industrial, and our irrigation customers, agriculture, recreation, or urban. Our hope is that each of those bar charts going across the page are as close as we can to that horizontal black line, which is the system average adjustment of 5%. If we're different from that, that's due to changes in customer characteristics or changes in overall cost to provide service to those customer classes. And this provides us that relationship or that nexus for proportional and equitable rates for each customer class. What this shows is that the irrigation, recreation, and irrigation agriculture, the bars farthest across the page to the right, are not paying their cost of service at this point in time. And so we need to adjust those rates greater than the system average But those on the left-hand side of the bar, we adjust slightly less for year one of the analysis. In the out years, then we adjust everybody equally from a cost of service perspective. So now that we know on the next slide what the overall revenue needs are for the water utility and the cost of service results in the unit cost, then we can develop the rates through the rate design process. So the next slide provides us with our key assumptions to this. And as we talk about from a Proposition 218 perspective, we developed the maximum rates based on the results of the revenue requirement and cost of service analysis. And really those unit costs that come out of the cost of service to give us the overall charge or rate for the fixed monthly charge or the consumption charge for each of the tiers, allotment, or budgets for the different customer classes. At this point, there's no recommendation to change the structure or how you charge each of your customers. It's really a change in the level of the rates to reflect our overall revenue needs from the revenue requirement and the cost of service results that were developed from the unit costs. So each customer class or rate schedule has two components. The first is a fixed monthly meter charge. That charge is the same for all customers based on the size of the meter. With the exception of private fire, there's a different calculation for those. And that meter size varies based on the size of the meter. And that's based on the capacity that those larger meters can place on the system. The second piece is a variable or a consumption charge. And this really reflects how the customers use water. And it's reflected in a tier structure, in an allotment, or a budget amount for each of the different customer classes of service. And this is really where we looked at those cost of service results, where we saw for ag recreation and ag irrigation, that we saw that there was an increase in the need for, a larger increase needed from a cost of service perspective. And so what we've done is we've smoothed in the irrigation ag and irrigation rec over the next 3 years to meet our cost of service results over a 3-year period. And so that does result in a minor reduction in revenue, but we did that so that one customer class was not subsidizing another. And so that's a deferral of a minor amount of revenue for each customer, for the system. So the next slide provides us with our fixed monthly service charges. Going down the page is the size of the meter. So the larger the meter, the larger the fixed charge based on the relationship of this meter capacity for, let's say, a 10-inch at the bottom of a page to the 5/8-inch meter at the top of the page. And so those relationships are based on the capacity or the amount of water that each meter can go through. So we have the present rates in the second column. We have the proposed rates for fiscal year 22 in that third column. So for a 5/8-inch meter, it goes from $28.92 to $29.57. So an increase of 65 cents per month, or a 2.3% change. The right-hand columns then are increased by the system revenue adjustment, the 5%, in fiscal year 2023 and 2024 based on the 2022 and 2023 rates. So the $31.05 for a 5/8-inch meter, the top row, is a 5% increase from those proposed fiscal year 2022 rates. Again, the increased meter charge for each meter size is based on those capacities or those demands that are placed on the system. The next slide provides us with the start of our volumetric rates or our metered consumption rates. Same setup here. We have the type of rate on down the page for single family, multifamily as an example. The present rates, the proposed rates for fiscal year 2022, the dollar change and the percent change, and the proposed rates for 23-24. So single family and multifamily are charged a tier rate structure. So for single family, that's 0 to 4, so 0 to 400 cubic feet HCF. Each HCF is 748 gallons. You can see that increases for that first tier by 18 cents or 4.1% increase, whereas the upper tier, the 16 plus, increases by $1.91 or an 8% increase. These unit costs or the proposed rates in fiscal year 22 were based on the unit costs and the cost of service. So what supply source, as prioritized by the City Council, provides service to each of these tiers. A multifamily is calculated in the same manner, and it is the same rate as single family, but the tier sizes vary based on the number of units and customer. For recycled water, it's an increase of 3%, and it's a uniform rate, the same rate for all HCF or 100 cubic feet. And then commercial industrial has an allotment, a specific amount for each customer, and there's a rate for up to the allotment and over the allotment. You can see that changes. For the up to allotment, not much of a change, 4 cents per 100 cubic feet, and then a $1.90 increase in the over allotment. The next slide provides us with our remaining customer classes, our irrigation ag and irrigation rec. What's important to understand here is that up to budget amount has been averaged in over a 3-year period. So for irrigation ag, that 10% change in 2022 is also a 10% increase in 2023 and 2024 to reflect the cost of service results by 2024. So we've transitioned that in over a 3-year period. Similar approach with the irrigation recreation, the up to budget is an increase of 7.2%. That's increased by 7.2% in 23 and 24 as well to meet our cost of service results and transition that in to minimize the impacts to these customers as much as possible. All other customers, it's a 5% increase in 23 and 24 based on the 22 and 23 rates. On the next slide is the auxiliary master meter fee. This is a situation where there's a master meter that the city sets that provides service to multiple customers behind that meter. And so each customer, the municipal code requires that individual dwelling units be separately metered. In the cases where that can't happen, then there's this auxiliary master meter fee. This is read to balance out and make sure the sub meters or those meters on each of those properties are reading accurately and reflect the overall water use for those customers behind that meter. These were calculated based on the overall system needs, the cost of how the city incurs cost to provide these meters, and have been adjusted to reflect the overall cost out through the next 3-year period. On the next slide is our private fire line charges. Again, there's a component of the system that is there to provide standby capacity for customers with a separately metered or separate private fire line charge. These were recalculated in this cost of service and projected out over the next 3-year period based on the overall changes in the cost of providing private fire line services. So again, a 5 reset in 2022, and then 23 and 24 are 5% increases in those rates. And finally, what does this look like to each of your customers on the next slide? We have some bill comparisons to show you. And what this looks like here is for a single family, the top row, that is using only 4 HCF, 400 cubic feet. We have the current monthly bill, the proposed monthly bill, the dollar difference, and you can see that's a 2.9% increase in their rate or in their monthly bill. A 20 HCF user, the third line down, that'd be an increase of 6.3%. And so you can see it varies based on the amount of water that each customer uses. And that's based on the cost of providing that water, depending on the prioritized source based on the city council's approach to prioritizing overall water supply for the customers. There's the middle two for commercial is a restaurant that stays within their allotment or goes over their allotment. You can see that commercial restaurant that stays within their allotment has a very minor monthly bill increase, whereas the customer that goes over their allotment has an increase of about 2.4% in this example. Again, these will all vary based on each customer's individual water use. And then for irrigation agriculture that stays within their allotment and an irrigation rec that stays within the allotment, you can see those are the 9.3 and 7.1%. So again, that's that transition, not going to cost of service in year one, transitioning it in over a 3-year period to minimize the impacts to those customers. On the next slide, we have an overall summary of the comparison to other South Coast Utilities, you can see the city of Santa Barbara. These are the proposed rates for fiscal year 2022. You can see again at 4 HCF, 10 HCF, and 20 HCF. So those overall usage levels, how they compare with the other agencies in the area. Overall, very comparable from a low and moderate use, the 4 and 10, and then the higher use reflects the overall price and cost of water to provide that higher level of service. And so slightly higher than Goleta, Montecito, or Carpinteria Valley Water District. But those 4 and 10 HCF are very comparable to those customers. Again, this is not an apples to apples comparison because we do know that others are going through or going to go through a rate study to review their overall water rate levels to reflect their operating and capital needs over the long term. And then finally, the next slide is our next steps for the water rate study. We're going through and developing the final rate study report, so the written document. We're working on that right now. We're planning on having that available in mid-April as if directed by the committee as we go forward through the Prop 218 process. We're also holding a public webinar on April 29. And so this will be a spot where we'll be able to provide information on, again, how we design and develop the water rates, how we develop the proposed charges and changes in customer bill impacts, and provide a spot for the public to gain some information on how to work with their bill, what that bill may look like for that. And then as we move forward, one of the tasks we have in the study is to work with staff to develop recommendation for, and I'll call it an enhanced customer assistance program. And I say enhanced because you do have a lot of programs in place today. You have methods and ways to help customers. This is reflective of the $150,000 that we built in the rates into the future to provide additional assistance to those customers that really need the help, that are struggling to pay water bills or have life events that they need help with their water bill on as we go through this. And with that, the next slide will start the solid waste, and I will turn that over to the Sustainability and Resilience Department for that discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Corn. Before we go there, I'd like to break it up between the two if possible, since we're here and we have you on here. So I will open it up first to questions from my colleagues regarding the rates or any questions you have. I see Councilmember Harmon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Thank you very much. Just a couple of questions for you. First, let me go back to the slide. I apologize. So I think it was slide 6. We were talking about some of the things that need to be done. And one of the things was about the replacement of reservoirs as a capital project. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to whether that specifically needs to be done in this period. I mean, I know we all have major concerns about raising rates, especially in this moment. So I'm just wondering if you can explain to us and to the public, whether all of these projects need to be done in this cycle and what are the implications if we hold off on them. We can just speak to that, maybe Mr. Hamilton. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Chair Friedman, Committee Member Harmon. Both of these projects actually were slightly resequenced when we decided to forego a rate increase last year. So when we're talking about, and I believe I'm just looking at the slide here, the Decatur Water Treatment Plant finished water reservoir, and Vic Trace Reservoir, we're actually talking about funding just the design aspect within this rate schedule and the construction to follow sometime after. Those projects, the Decatur project, will be constructed at the tail end of this rate structure, and the Vic Trace project, which is pretty large and will ultimately be financed through SRF, is several years out. So we've already done what we can in terms of capital project sequencing to ease the burden on rates in this current 3-year period. And Ms. Flessy, did you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Councilwoman Harmon, my name is Amanda Flessy. I'm the Acting Water Resources Manager. And to speak on the need for these, Vic Trace and Decatur Reservoir, those are both essential reservoirs that help us feed the majority of our of our customers. So we actually need VicTrace in use while we're doing the Cater project, and then we need the Cater project to be done and completed if we are to move forward with the VicTrace project. So they're kind of tied and interlinked together as far as a system-wide project goes.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. My next question, I guess I'm not even quite sure really how to formulate it, so bear with me here. We received a public comment from a city resident who has concerns about the major or significant increase in for agricultural uses, just that metering cost. And the concern was, you know, their agricultural use is for immature trees, if I remember correctly, not even commercially viable trees yet, and this would be a significant burden for them. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to just sort of generally what the agricultural uses are in the city that justify that sort of significant percentage increase, and whether we reached out to any of those users in particular to communicate with them about this, or I guess alternatively, whether we plan to specifically connect. And I'm interested to know how many users we have that would fall within that category in the city of Santa Barbara also. Thanks. There was a lot there, so however person I
Let me start, Chair Friedman, Committee Member Harmon. We've, in particular to I think the comment that was submitted, we've had a lot of dialogue with that customer in particular. One thing we'll tell customers, and the exercise we went through here was, if you feel that the fixed meter charge is too high, or that your meter is larger than it needs to be, you can always hire a landscape expert, go through the process of looking at your demands and whether you need that, and we can reduce your meter size appropriately if that is appropriate. The other thing I'd say is in the last year, as we were going through the pandemic, we've had a numerous kind of public meetings that are always open, of course, for information, and public can participate in. All of our customers will be receiving a rate notice, every single one of our customers, with the individual rate increases and everything that goes into that, so they will all be notified. And then I would finally say, in terms of agricultural customers, they're a very small portion of our customers in terms of number and use. So I think we're talking about roughly 50, and I can get you the backup slide here on that. Yeah, so it looks like about 65 irrigation agricultural customers, and probably about 1% or less of the total use in the system. One thing we've done for agricultural customers, or really council has done, is they've adopted a policy that allocates the cheapest water source to the highest priority users. And right now, the highest priority user, and it shares that distinction with no other customer, is irrigation agricultural customers. So they are seeing a pretty significant increase over 3 years, absolutely, but they will continue to have the lowest volumetric rate among all the customer classes in any of the 3 years that we're adopting. So really, at this point, a lot's been done to mitigate those increases by phasing in the rates and also taking that priority approach to the customer class.
Great, thank you. That's very, very helpful. And then my final question sort of flows from that, and that's to talk about a little bit more about public outreach. I appreciate that you will be having that public meeting on the 29th, and I am wondering whether that webinar will be recorded so folks can view it later, and if it's not, I would ask that it would be. And then also, if you can just talk to us a little bit about the plan to inform the public about this webinar, and how are we going to let people know that it's happening, particularly, you know, for those of us who are renters, we don't always get water bills. So if it comes as a notice in the water bill, you know, it's something I would be curious about. Even though I don't pay the water, the cost gets passed on to me, so it's something I, as a renter, definitely would want to be engaged in. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about just the outreach plan for the 29th, and where folks can sign up to participate in this. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing we're doing this year that's different than previous years is in the notice that customers receive, we're doing it in kind of an enhanced engagement letter, which will talk about a lot of the story behind the projects and the need for the projects, and we went through some of that in the presentation today. We're going to utilize all of kind of the standard outlets that we have. So there's city news and brief that goes out to the community. We can notice through local media publications on the city's website. We have a specific rate change webpage that will also include the webinar on, and it will also be in the date, time. It will be in the Prop 218 notice, so everyone who gets that will be aware. But I think you do hit on the opportunity to do a lot of outreach, and it is difficult in terms of other efforts that we have to reach the renters if they're not specifically the person who receives the water bill. So trying to utilize all of our kind of media and current outlets.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair Friedman.
Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. Excellent questions. I had some of the same myself in terms of what the impacts were. If you could just I have one more. If you could pull up slide 10. I think this gets into the capital investment questions that were asked and why they're so important. Just wanted to understand if we were to come in with maybe not increase the rates and enhance the rates so that we can meet our capital needs. And this slide kind of shows what would the impacts be down the line if we weren't able to make the capital investments that came out of these new proposed rates.
Chair Friedman, let me start, and Mr. Korn and Ms. Plessy, please feel free to jump in after. I would say that particularly if we're thinking about investment in the water main replacement program, down the line you create a situation where you have potentially increasing emergency repairs, which leads to increasing costs in the operation of the system. So you're putting off an issue today that becomes a problem later on when you have kind of underinvestment in the system over time. So I think that would be my first point on that. Open it up to my co-panelists.
I'll jump in. Thank you, Chair Friedman. Mr. Hamilton is exactly right. I believe it was last year we made the commitment to move forward from to start reinvesting in our system at a 2% rate, which is 6 miles of water main replacement, approximately. We were doing 3 miles, and we just were not catching up with the significant breaks that were going on in our city. So last year we upped it to the 6 miles, and with that, we can catch up with our aging infrastructure. When we start reducing the amount, we stop being proactive in our system and we start being reactive to our system. And we start getting major main breaks that can be very destructive to other infrastructure and other properties. And it takes away from our capital projects that we can be using that money to reinvesting in our infrastructure. And instead, we are repairing and reacting to our failing infrastructure. So it's kind of a balancing act.
I think I just wanted to put that out there that a significant portion of these rates is for capital investment in the proactive and the impacts that would happen if we weren't to go forward. And we might end up paying these anyways in terms of emergency repairs. And there'd be impacts to businesses and homeowners as well. So I just wanted to put that out there of why it's essential in the capital investment project that we have. So I don't have any further questions. So thank you. So now I'm going to open it up to any public comment for any items for this item. And any member of the public who wishes to speak, please raise your hand in the online app. Mr. Hamilton, do you see anybody? I don't see anyone.
Yeah, Chair Friedman, we still have the solid waste presentation after this, but
I was splitting it up for the water, so I figured we would just stay consistent with the public.
Great. There was a customer, Ms. Jasinski, that had intended to speak. She may have had a conflict. I'm not able to see public attendee list, but I did want to make sure if she's on there that she has an opportunity to speak.
Ms. Nicholson, do you see if anyone wishes to speak to the water at this point?
Yes, Chair Friedman, if I may, I do not see any hands raised at this moment. I am monitoring public comment. I do see Ms. Jasinski is attending the meeting today, but her hand is not raised at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And then I'll open it up for public comment after the solid waste as well. So any further comments at this point from or questions from council members? Hearing none, we'll change over to Ms. Irely.
Committee Chair Friedman, committee members Gutierrez and Harmon. I'm Dustin Roback, Senior Environmental Specialist with the Environmental Services Division. Today I will be presenting the proposed solid waste rates for fiscal year 22. Next slide. There are three areas to discuss: the factors affecting revenue and service stability, the components of revenue requirements, the proposed solid waste rates for fiscal year 22. Next slide. As seen here, these elements provide context for the scale and constraints of the solid waste fund. We have large long-term contracts, our revenues are strongly affected by the economy, and there are regulatory demands that we must accommodate. Next slide, please. I'm going to explain how the annual rate increase is driven by increased costs in three areas. We have the compensation due to Marburg for their collection services per their contract, the material delivery agreement that we have as a contract with the county, and then changing system and service demands. Next slide, please. Our contract with Marburg establishes specific requirements for increasing their compensation every year based on the Consumer Price Index. For fiscal year 22, this requires rates to be increased by 1%. Next slide. Another major contract is the material delivery agreement with the county, which funds the construction and operation of the resource center at the Taheguas landfill. We have committed to paying increased disposal fees so that our material that would otherwise go to the landfill is instead sorted of the recyclable and organic materials, and then that is diverted for improved environmental benefits. Next slide, please. Because the county relies on a dependable amount of material and revenue to fund the large capital project, we are contractually obligated to deliver 75,000 tons per year, or pay to make up the difference. With the pandemic causing a reduction in solid waste service, we need to anticipate being held to the terms of the contract, which means we need to collect another $900,000 in revenues. Next slide, please. SB 1383 was passed in 2016 and is the most significant waste reduction mandate in California in the last 30 years. It requires a 75% organic waste disposal reduction by 2025 and a 20% recovery of edible food. The law targets organic waste for two reasons. It is the largest percentage of waste and creates significant greenhouse gas emissions via methane. SB 1383 builds on the mandatory organics recycling law, AB 1826, which the city of Santa Barbara has been implementing successfully since 2016 and has been a leader statewide. The nature of waste management in Santa Barbara is also changing. When the Resource Center begins operation later this year, our system is going to be significantly different from in the past. This necessitates a cost of service study and rate restructuring to reflect the new system. We had originally planned to include this contract in the FY21 budget, but delayed it to provide rate relief last year. Next slide. Putting all this together, we get the proposed solid waste rates. Collection is 1%, processing and disposal is 4.6%, system improvements account for 1.7%. We also have the clean SB funding that is needed to meet increased demand for maintaining public spaces. In total, the rates are increasing by 7.5%, which is mostly driven by contractual and regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. Looking at how this affects some representative residential customer profiles, we see the change to the monthly bill is $4 for a single family residential customer, $7 for a 2 to 4 unit small residential customer, and $29 for a 5+ unit large residential customer. On the next slide, we will see the customer profiles for business customers. Monthly rate for a small business with cart service would increase by about $37, or $103 for a large business with dumpsters. Next slide, please. For context, we see here the current FY21 monthly bills for single-family residents throughout the South Coast. The City of Santa Barbara's customers' bills are in line with the residents of Goleta and the county. All of these areas are subject to the same disposal fee increases and regulatory requirements, so their FY22 bills are expected to increase similarly to the proposed rates. Next slide, please. This demonstrates the combined impact of the water and solid waste rate increases for a representative single-family customer. Taken together, this customer will see a 5.5% increase in their monthly bill. Next slide, please. Please consider the following recommendations. A, receive a presentation on proposed wastewater rates for fiscal years 2022, 2023, and 2024, and solid waste rates for fiscal year 2022. B, set a public hearing date for June 15th, 2020 at 2 p.m. for consideration of increases to the city's water and solid waste rates. And C, direct staff to send a notice of public hearing to customers informing them of the public hearing and proposed changes to water and solid waste rates. Next slide. I would now like to open the presentation for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murback, for the presentation. And are there any questions regarding solid waste rates from my colleagues? Seeing none, I do have a question. It came out in the staff report. There was an issue with, per the recycling, per the agreement with the county, we commit to a certain percentage or a certain number of tonnage that we deliver, and we are underperforming this year. So there's the one-time cost. And does that one-time cost factor into this year's rates? And then is it ongoing, or is it just for this underperformance of rates of tonnage that goes to the landfill?
It will be factored into the FY22 rates for what we expect in that fiscal year. And then moving forward, we will adjust based on how we're seeing the tonnage recover after the pandemic resolves.
So if we get back to where the tonnage is, that additional fee it would be adjusted. So this is a one-time part of that cost component for this year.
That's correct.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions. And so at this point, I would open it up for public comment for this item. And if you want to speak the water as well. So Mr. DeMartini, do you see anyone raising their hand in the app?
Yes, Chair Friedman, I was informed by staff that Ms. Jasinski was having a technical issue with raising her hand. So I'm going to unmute her right now and see if we can give her the opportunity to speak. And so I'm going to unmute you, Ms. Jasinski. Ms. Jasinski, are you there? And Ms. Nickerson, if you could also assist with trying to unmute her. Let's see if we can get her opportunity to speak to the public.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, excellent. Thank you. And I appreciate the professionalism of your staff, especially Malcolm. Even though I oppose what he's recommending, he's professional enough to let me speak. Thank you. My biggest concern is with obviously the rate of the water increase, and especially to the ag increase. The chart indicates the spread of 3 years, but as you know, the total increase is 19.6%. And this is tremendously unfair to agricultural customers, and especially small farmers. And in fact, I think you may be aware of this, but tree farmers have a whole different problem, because when they have younger crops, which we do with avocados, our avocados are 9 years old and they're not commercially viable until usually they're 14 or 15 years. And also it takes water for them to be commercially viable. The more we withhold water, the longer it takes to make them commercially profitable. So I'm asking you, please do not make such a huge increase on the backs of farmers. And I know you have a lot of money to gain in terms of the water main replacement, but I have yet to see literal data on, or a formula, so to speak, on why this is an appropriate share of the cost of irrigation water for farmers. So I urge you, if nothing else, to create a category for tree farmers, and especially with young fruit. It's a whole different story once the trees are mature, and we don't mind paying that extra, but you're talking about several thousands of dollars of increase at a time when the crop can't begin to cover any really significant portion of that cost. So I do appreciate your allowing me to speak, and I hope also, by the way, that you have a copy of the email that I sent earlier this morning outlining these concerns as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jasinski. I appreciate your comments. Mr. DeMartini, was there anyone else for public comment?
Chair Friedman, I'm seeing no other hands raised at this time.
I will close public comment. So I do want to ask the question about, I think public comment raises a good issue on agriculture, especially since we have very few customers remaining in agricultural utilities. So I'm wondering, Mr. Hamilton, if you might be able to come on for a moment. And I wanted to see I understand we have that with Prop 218 and subsidizing other users, but is there a way to perhaps maybe even amortize out the agricultural over even a greater amount of time? Say instead of 3 years, if we could do it further, is there any way that we could provide some type of relief over this time, and perhaps maybe if we don't have an answer today, maybe look at it before it comes to council? I just want to explore all the options that we have, because this will come to council fully, and I would expect that these questions would be raised at council as well. So is there a way we can maybe look at amortizing it more, or there are other ways we can work with the very small number of agricultural users on this to lessen the impact of these rates?
Yes, Chair Friedman, I think what the rates that we're proposing today and that were attached to the staff report are the maximum rates that will be adopted by City Council on June 15th. So I think we can take direction to, in the meantime, look at opportunities and the possibility of not charging the full cost of service. I think we have to be very careful, though, in terms of Proposition 218, that no other customer class is paying more because we choose to not charge the full cost of service for irrigation agricultural customers. And, you know, I would reiterate that we can definitely look at that. The rate model as it stands really does the most it can to provide the lowest rate currently to irrigation agricultural customers. And additionally, there's customer classes that potentially council would want to, you know, also prioritize, such as basic health and sanitation needs for residential customers and irrigation recreation needs as well. So with that being said, we can bring that back at the public hearing and talk about ways. There are ways, I think, to potentially do it over a longer period of time. It gets a little more complicated because it's outside of our 3-year rate study period. So we'd have to work with HDR to achieve that.
I would just say, I think for today's purposes, I think forwarding the recommendation to council, I think is a good place to start. This is my comments, but I would suspect that these types of questions would come up at the council. So maybe having information available at that hearing to give the council options and understanding both the pros and the cons of it and how it would relate to Prop 218 would be helpful for when it comes to council, should other colleagues not on outside the finance committee have those same questions. So just to have that information for the full council. So that's the only comments I have right now, is just like to have more understanding of if there are other possibilities and how we can do that. So with that, at this point, public comments closed. So I'd like to hear from my colleagues if there's a motion or further comments.
Chair Friedman, I don't have my video. I apologize, but can you hear me? This is Megan.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. Having some tech issues on my end. So I'm just going to make my comments, and then I'll be happy to make the motion to forward staff recommendations. I agree with you, Chair Friedman. I think it would be really useful for us to at least explore those questions before it comes to the full council. I understand and appreciate that this is incredibly challenging. I think we're now seeing sort of that space where our values sometimes come into competition with one another. You know, we all understand how important it is to maintain the infrastructure of our water services. We also, I think, as a community, value and want to prioritize our small farmers, especially small farmers that provide local food sources. So this is certainly challenging, and I appreciate the continued conversation. I would very much like to see what it would look like to extend or amortize over a longer period the agriculture ratepayer category. So I guess I'm repeating myself here, but I think Councilmember Friedman's correct that this will likely be a conversation that we'll be having at the full council. So while I'm very happy to forward the recommendations and we'll make that motion, I think it's important that we're prepared to have this conversation, when it comes to the full council. I myself, would like to see the impacts of that expanded timeline. And it's something that, without knowing the details, I think I would be supportive of. So would really appreciate that. I know it's some extra work, but I think it's really important that we flesh this out to the fullest extent possible. So with that, I will make the recommendations that we forward this to the full council. I know to the public who may be watching, this is never an easy conversation to have. And it's one that I'm frankly not comfortable with myself having right now, especially in light of all that our community has gone through, particularly in this last year. But, we're in a position where unfortunately we've delayed some of these changes, it sounds like, to the fullest extent we can, while also maintaining the level of service that our neighbors deserve and expect. So I look forward to continued conversation about this. I, again, would encourage our staff members, as I know they've been doing, to be as robust as possible in their public outreach. And I will make sure that I do my best to share the information with constituents as well. I guess with that, I do want to say thank you. I know staff, you've heard that this is not something that we want to do, and I appreciate that you have taken the time to try to figure out ways to ameliorate this as much as possible, and that you'll continue to do so as we move forward in this conversation. So with that, I will move that we forward staff recommendations to the full council.
Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. The motion's been made, and I see Councilmember Gutierrez. You have the floor.
I want to second the motion.
Thank you. The motion's been seconded. So I will just echo Councilmember Harmon's comments. This is a very difficult time to be considering the proposed rate increases. However, we also need to look at these systems because they are essential quality of life systems, our water and our solid waste, and the capital investment that needs to go with them. And if we delay it, we end up actually having more costs down the line. So for us to continue to be able to make those investments to secure those systems so that we can rely upon them as a community is something that we really need to invest in now. And it is a difficult choice, but it is one that we don't want to punt down to a later time and have to have even greater increases at a time when if we don't do it now, you could have much more higher rate increases at the time down the road. So we will have a full discussion at the council on it. And so I think the direction, we'll take a vote in just a second, is for the staff recommendation, but also get that additional information regarding agricultural ratepayers. So with that, if we could have a roll call vote, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair Friedman. So the recommendation before the Finance Committee this afternoon is to receive the presentation on the water rates and the solid waste rate increases for fiscal years 22, 23, and 24. set a public hearing for June 15th, 2020 for consideration of the water and waste, solid waste rate increases, and then direct staff to send out the public, the notice of public hearing to customers. Take a roll call vote. We'll start with Committee Member Gutierrez,
Yes.
Committee Member Harmon,
Yes.
and Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
Thank you, Mr. DiMartini, and thank you to all our staff and Mr. Korn for putting together all that information for us and for your continued work over the coming 2 months until we come in June. And with that, that's our items for today. So the March 30th meeting of the Finance Committee is adjourned. Thank you.